A young lawyer stands in the court of Henry VIII, watching his friend and mentor being stripped of his titles and paraded through London as a traitor. Thomas More had been Lord Chancellor of England, the highest office in the land after the king himself. He'd been advisor to the most powerful monarch in Europe, trusted confidant, and brilliant legal mind. Now, he's headed to the Tower of London, condemned to death for refusing to sign a single piece of paper. His crime? He wouldn't declare that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was lawful. He wouldn't acknowledge the king as supreme head of the Church of England. In an age when power meant everything, More chose principle over survival. This wasn't the decision of a reckless idealist or religious fanatic. This was the choice of arguably the most sophisticated political thinker of the Renaissance, a man who'd written extensively about governance, justice, and the relationship between individual conscience and political authority. More had spent his entire life navigating the dangerous waters of power politics while maintaining his moral integrity. He'd risen to the highest ranks of government precisely because of his wisdom, discretion, and legal brilliance. Yet when the ultimate test came, he chose death over compromise. This moment represents something far more profound than religious martyrdom or political stubbornness. It crystallizes a philosophy of human dignity, moral courage, and the limits of political authority that More had been developing throughout his extraordinary life. Here was a man who'd imagined an ideal society in his revolutionary work Utopia, who'd practiced law with legendary skill, who'd served as diplomat and counselor to kings, who'd written theological treatises and works of devotion. Everything in his experience prepared him to understand exactly what he was sacrificing and why it mattered. Most people know Thomas More, if they know him at all, as the man who got beheaded for defying Henry VIII. Some remember him as the author of Utopia, that book about an imaginary island society. Catholics venerate him as a saint and martyr, but these fragments miss the comprehensive philosophy of politics, ethics, law, and human nature that More developed through decades of practical experience in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. If this kind of deep dive into history and philosophy resonates with you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button or subscribe. It really does make a difference. I'm always fascinated by where everyone's tuning in from, so leave a comment telling me your city and what time it is where you are. There's something special about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, sharing these stories together. All right, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights. Put on some soft background noise if that's your thing, and settle in for tonight's exploration. We're diving into why Thomas More matters, not just as a historical figure, but as someone whose ideas about power, conscience, and what it means to live with integrity speak directly to the challenges we're facing right now. What emerges from examining More's life and writings is a sophisticated understanding of political philosophy that addresses the questions every society must confront. How much authority should governments have over individual conscience? What makes laws legitimate or tyrannical? How can societies balance prosperity with justice? What are the limits of loyalty to political leaders? How should educated people engage with power? When does compromise become complicity? More answered these questions not through abstract theorizing alone, but by living through some of the most turbulent political upheavals in European history, while maintaining positions of responsibility and influence. His philosophy was forged in the fires of real political crisis, tested in courtrooms and council chambers, and ultimately validated through his willingness to die for his convictions. This wasn't armchair philosophy debated in universities. It was practical wisdom developed through decades of navigating the intersection of power, law, and morality in circumstances where mistakes could mean death. More proved that it's possible to be both effective in worldly affairs and uncompromising in matters of principle, both sophisticated in political understanding and faithful to moral truth, both pragmatic in methods and idealistic in ultimate aims. His life demonstrates that intellectual excellence, professional success, and moral integrity need not conflict, but can reinforce each other when properly understood and integrated. He showed that serving in government doesn't require surrendering your ethical standards, that political realism doesn't mean moral cynicism, and that sometimes the most politically effective choice is refusing to compromise on fundamental principles. What makes More's philosophy especially relevant today is that he faced dilemmas remarkably similar to those confronting modern individuals living under political systems that increasingly demand compliance with policies that may violate personal conscience. How do you maintain integrity while participating in institutions that sometimes act unjustly? When does cooperation become collaboration with evil? What are your obligations to society versus your obligations to truth? More's answers to these questions come not from someone standing on the sidelines criticizing others, but from someone who exercised real power and understood its temptations, limitations, and proper uses. He knew what he was talking about because he'd been there, made those choices, and faced those consequences. His insights carry the weight of lived experience rather than theoretical speculation. Part 1: The Education of a Humanist and the Birth of Renaissance Idealism. Thomas More was born in 1478 into a London that was emerging from medieval darkness into the brilliant light of the Renaissance. His father, John More, was a successful lawyer and judge, embodying the rising professional class that was beginning to challenge the traditional aristocratic monopoly on power and influence. From his earliest years, Thomas was immersed in a world where education, merit, and professional skill could elevate a family's status in ways that had been impossible in previous generations. This social mobility through intellectual achievement would shape More's entire worldview. He came from people who believed that ideas mattered, that learning could change lives, and that individuals could rise through ability rather than birth alone. It created in him a fundamental optimism about human potential that persisted even in his darkest moments. At age 12, More was placed in the household of John Morton, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England. This wasn't just education, it was apprenticeship in the arts of governance, diplomacy, and political survival at the highest levels. Morton's household functioned as a kind of finishing school for promising young men from the professional classes, preparing them for careers in law, government, or the church. Here More observed firsthand how power actually worked in Renaissance England. He saw how competing interests were negotiated, how laws were made and enforced, how religious authority intersected with political power, and how individuals navigated the dangerous currents of favor and disfavor at court. Morton recognized More's exceptional abilities and took personal interest in his development, predicting that the young man would grow to greatness. This early exposure to practical politics gave More an insider's understanding of government that would distinguish him from more purely academic thinkers. From Morton's household, More went to Oxford, where he encountered the revolutionary ideas of Renaissance humanism. The humanist movement was transforming European intellectual life by recovering and studying classical Greek and Roman texts that had been lost or neglected during the Middle Ages. But humanism wasn't just about reading old books. It represented a fundamental shift in how people thought about human nature, education, and society's purposes. The humanists believed that studying classical literature, philosophy, and rhetoric could develop human potential and create better citizens and leaders. They emphasized that human beings were capable of great achievements when properly educated, that reason and eloquence were crucial for civilized life, and that learning should serve practical purposes in improving society rather than existing purely for its own sake. More immersed himself in classical languages, literature, and philosophy with passionate intensity. He learned Latin so thoroughly that he could compose elegant prose and poetry in the language. He studied Greek at a time when few scholars in England possessed that skill, giving him direct access to ancient texts that most people knew only through medieval Latin translations. He read Plato's Republican Laws, absorbing ideas about ideal societies and just governance. He studied Aristotle's ethics and politics, learning systematic approaches to moral philosophy and political science. He engaged deeply with Roman Stoic philosophers like Cicero and Seneca, who taught that virtue consists in living according to reason and nature while maintaining integrity regardless of external circumstances. These classical sources gave more intellectual resources for thinking critically about his own society's arrangements. The ancient philosophers provided alternative models for organizing political communities, different conceptions of justice and human flourishing, and arguments for subordinating power to law and reason. But More didn't simply absorb these ideas uncritically. Even as a student, he began developing his characteristic approach of learning from various sources while synthesizing them into his own distinctive philosophy. He recognized that classical thinkers offered profound insights about human nature and social organization, but that Christian revelation added dimensions of understanding that the ancients couldn't access. This integration of classical philosophy with Christian theology would become the hallmark of Renaissance humanism and of More's mature thought. After Oxford, More returned to London to study law at New Inn, and then Lincoln's Inn, the premier legal training institutions of the era. This legal education proved crucial for his intellectual development because it taught him to think with extraordinary precision about concepts like justice, rights, obligations, and the relationship between law and morality. The common law tradition in which More was trained emphasized reasoning from particular cases to general principles, close attention to precedents and established procedures, and the idea that law develops through careful interpretation rather than arbitrary decree. This approach reinforced habits of mind that More would apply to philosophical and theological questions throughout his life. During these years of legal training, More wrestled with profound questions about his vocation and life's direction. He was drawn to religious life and seriously considered becoming a monk. For about 4 years, he lived near the Carthusian monastery in London, participating in their prayers and austere discipline while continuing his legal studies. The Carthusians were known as the strictest religious order, practicing rigorous poverty, long hours of prayer, and almost complete silence. That More found this life attractive reveals something crucial about his character. He wasn't driven primarily by worldly ambition or desire for comfort. He genuinely struggled with the question of how to best serve God and use his abilities. He sought the disciplined spiritual life because he understood that the ultimate questions about human existence weren't political or legal, but spiritual and moral. Ultimately, More decided against the monastery, concluding that he was called to serve God in the world rather than in religious seclusion. But he maintained monastic disciplines throughout his life, wearing a hair shirt under his clothes as reminder of the spiritual dimension of existence, rising early for extensive prayers, and practicing a degree of self-denial, unusual for someone in his social position. This decision to engage with worldly affairs while maintaining spiritual discipline would characterize More's entire approach to life. He believed that lay people could achieve holiness through faithful discharge of their worldly duties, that political service could be a form of religious devotion, and that one didn't need to flee the world to live righteously within it. In 1505, More married Jane Colt, a young woman from an Essex gentry family. Together, they had 4 children: Margaret, Elizabeth, Cecily, and John. More proved to be an unusually devoted father by the standards of his time, taking personal interest in his children's education and moral development. He insisted that his daughters receive the same rigorous classical education as his son, a radical position in an era when female learning was generally limited to domestic skills and basic literacy. His household became famous as a kind of school of humanistic learning, where children of both sexes studied Latin, Greek, philosophy, and theology, alongside training in practical skills and moral virtue. More believed that education should develop the whole person, intellect, character, and practical judgment together. His approach emphasized that learning should be enjoyable rather than forced, that understanding matters more than memorization, and that the ultimate purpose of education is becoming a better person rather than simply accumulating knowledge. These educational principles reflected his broader philosophy of human development. He understood that people learn best when they're engaged and curious rather than coerced, that genuine understanding requires active participation rather than passive reception, and that intellectual growth must be accompanied by moral development to be truly valuable. After Jane's death in 1511, More married Alice Middleton, a widow several years his senior. The marriage was reportedly happy, despite being arranged largely for practical reasons of household management and child care. Alice was known for her practical competence and sharp tongue, providing grounding counterbalance to More's scholarly inclinations and idealistic tendencies. During these years, More's legal career flourished. He developed a reputation as one of the most brilliant lawyers in London, known for his ability to construct compelling arguments, his comprehensive knowledge of precedents and procedures, and his integrity in dealing with clients and opposing counsel. He argued cases involving complex commercial disputes, property rights, and interpretation of statutes. His success brought financial security and growing reputation that attracted attention from powerful figures seeking his services. But More's legal practice was more than a career. It was an education in human nature and social reality. In courtrooms and legal negotiations, he encountered the full range of human motives and behaviors. He saw how people rationalized their interests, how they constructed self-serving interpretations of laws and contracts, and how they used legal procedures for both just and unjust purposes. This practical experience with human nature would inform his later political philosophy and his skepticism about purely legalistic approaches to justice. He understood that laws could be manipulated by clever arguments, that people often confused legality with morality, and that formal procedures didn't guarantee just outcomes without good faith and reasonable interpretation. More's literary career began during this period with the publication of his translations, poems, and historical works. He translated works from Greek, demonstrating his linguistic skills while making classical texts accessible to English readers. He wrote witty epigrams in Latin that circulated among humanist scholars across Europe, establishing his reputation in international intellectual circles. His literary output wasn't mere recreation or showing off. It was part of the humanist project of using eloquence and learning to improve society. More believed that literature could educate readers morally and politically, that wit and humor could expose folly and vice more effectively than stern moralizing, and that the writer had responsibility to use his gifts for public benefit. In 1515, More joined a diplomatic mission to Flanders to negotiate commercial treaties on behalf of English merchants. This experience proved transformative, exposing him to different political systems and social arrangements while giving him extended time for reading and reflection. During this mission, More began writing his most famous work, Utopia. The book's structure is deceptively simple. It presents a dialogue between More himself and a fictional traveler named Raphael Hythloday, who describes his visit to an island called Utopia, where society is organized on completely different principles than European kingdoms. But beneath this simple framework lies one of the most sophisticated works of political philosophy in Western literature. Utopia describes a society without private property, where all goods are held in common and distributed according to need rather than market forces or inheritance. Citizens rotate through different jobs, ensuring that everyone shares both intellectual labor and physical work. Gold and jewels are despised rather than treasured, with gold being used for chamber pots and chains for criminals to emphasize its lack of real value. The Utopians value learning and philosophical discussion, with citizens spending their leisure time in educational pursuits rather than idle amusement. Their laws are simple and few, eliminating the need for lawyers and the manipulation of complex legal codes. They practice religious tolerance, allowing different faiths to coexist peacefully rather than enforcing religious uniformity through persecution. Slavery exists, but it's reserved for criminals and prisoners of war rather than being based on birth or race, and slaves can earn their freedom through good behavior. Generations of readers have debated what More actually intended with this description. Was he seriously proposing these arrangements as better alternatives to European society? Or was he satirizing both contemporary Europe and utopian thinking itself? Did he believe that society without private property was genuinely achievable? Or was he demonstrating the impractical nature of such schemes? The genius of Utopia lies partly in its ambiguity. More presents the ideal society through the voice of Raphael, whose name means God's healer, but also God's gossip in Greek, suggesting both seriousness and unreliability. More, the character in the dialogue, expresses skepticism about many of Raphael's claims, noting that the utopian system contains features that seem impossible to implement in actual societies. This structure allows More to explore radical alternatives to existing social arrangements while maintaining plausible deniability about his actual beliefs. He could present revolutionary ideas about property, governance, and social organization without explicitly endorsing them, protecting himself from charges of sedition or heresy, while stimulating readers to think critically about their own societies. What's clear is that Utopia serves as mirror for examining European society's defects. By describing an alternative social order, More forces readers to recognize that many arrangements they take for granted as natural or inevitable are actually human constructs that could be organized differently. Private property, hereditary aristocracy, aggressive warfare, ostentatious luxury, religious persecution, these features of European society that seemed unchangeable are revealed as choices that produce specific consequences. The Utopian's communal property system challenges the assumption that private ownership is necessary for social order or economic productivity. Their rotation of labor questions the rigid class divisions that characterized European society. Their simple laws critique the complexity and manipulation of European legal systems. Their religious tolerance condemns the religious warfare and persecution that plagued 16th century Europe. Through these contrasts, More accomplishes what the best political philosophy always does. He makes the familiar strange, forcing readers to examine assumptions they'd never questioned before. He demonstrates that social arrangements that seem natural or divinely ordained are actually human creations that reflect particular values and serve particular interests. The book's title itself is brilliantly ambiguous. Utopia in Greek means both good place and no place, simultaneously an ideal society and an impossibility. This wordplay captures More's sophisticated understanding that ideals serve crucial functions even if they can never be fully realized. They provide standards for evaluating existing societies, inspire efforts at improvement, and prevent complacent acceptance of injustice and dysfunction. The publication of Utopia established More's reputation as one of Europe's leading intellectuals. The book circulated among humanist scholars across the continent, generating discussion and debate that spread More's fame far beyond England. Here was a layman, not a university professor or theologian, who could write with sophistication about political philosophy while entertaining readers with wit and imagination. The success of Utopia brought More to the attention of King Henry VIII, who was assembling a group of humanist advisors to enhance the intellectual prestige of his court. The king prided himself on his learning and wanted to surround himself with the finest minds in England. He saw in More someone who combined intellectual brilliance with practical legal and political skills, exactly the kind of counselor a Renaissance prince should have. Part 2. The Scholar in Power and the Art of Political Navigation. More's entry into royal service marked a fundamental shift in his life's trajectory. Up to this point, he'd been able to maintain a certain intellectual independence, critiquing society through his writings while avoiding direct responsibility for governance. Now, he would be thrust into the machinery of power itself, forced to confront the gap between philosophical ideals and political realities in the most direct way possible. Initially, More resisted these royal summons. He understood intuitively what many intellectuals fail to grasp, that accepting power means accepting complicity in actions you might personally oppose, that advising rulers requires compromise with principles, and that the higher you rise in government, the more your freedom to speak truth diminishes. His reluctance wasn't cowardice or false modesty. It reflected genuine wisdom about the corrupting nature of power and the incompatibility between philosophical integrity and political success. He knew from his legal practice and diplomatic experience that powerful people rarely want honest advice that challenges their inclinations. They want intelligent justification for decisions they've already made and sophisticated arguments to defeat opposition to their plans. But Henry VIII was persistent, and More's own sense of duty ultimately prevailed over his prudent reluctance. If the king wanted his services, refusing seemed both ungrateful and potentially suspicious. More likely also believed that he could do genuine good by serving, that he might influence policy in positive directions, and that someone of his integrity was needed in government precisely because power tends to attract the unprincipled. In 1517, More entered the King's Council, beginning his ascent through the ranks of government. He served on diplomatic missions, negotiated treaties, drafted legal documents, and advised on policy matters ranging from trade to religious reform. His legal expertise and classical learning made him invaluable for the complex negotiations and sophisticated argumentation that characterized Renaissance diplomacy. More proved to be an extraordinarily effective royal servant. He possessed the rare combination of brilliant intellect and practical judgment, idealistic principles, and realistic assessment of possibilities. He could construct persuasive arguments for positions he'd been assigned to defend, navigate complex political situations with tact and discretion, and work productively with colleagues whose values differed from his own. His rise through the Tudor bureaucracy demonstrated that intellectuals could succeed in practical affairs when they understood that political effectiveness requires different skills than philosophical or literary achievement. Abstract reasoning must be supplemented with understanding of human psychology, institutional dynamics, and strategic timing. The ability to see all sides of complex questions, valuable in philosophical discourse, must be balanced with decisiveness when action becomes necessary. In 1523, More was elected Speaker of the House of Commons, a position that placed him at the intersection of royal power and parliamentary authority. As Speaker, More had to balance the King's demands for taxation with Parliament's resistance to excessive levies, maintaining working relationships with both sides while preserving his own integrity. He used his legal training to find compromises that satisfied immediate needs while establishing precedents that protected parliamentary privileges. His success in this delicate role demonstrated his political genius. He understood that effective governance requires building coalitions, finding common ground among competing interests, and framing issues in ways that allow different parties to support the same policies for different reasons. He showed that principle needn't conflict with pragmatism when you're clear about your fundamental commitments while remaining flexible about methods and tactics. Throughout these years of government service, More maintained his intellectual and spiritual life through extraordinary discipline. He rose before dawn for several hours of prayer and devotional reading. He continued studying classical and theological texts despite his crushing workload. He maintained correspondence with leading humanist scholars across Europe, discussing philosophical and religious questions. He continued writing, producing devotional works and controversial treatises defending Catholic theology against Protestant reformers. This combination of active political engagement and contemplative intellectual life embodied More's philosophy of how educated people should live. He believed that action without reflection becomes mindless or unprincipled, while reflection without action becomes sterile and self-indulgent. The examined life requires both philosophical depth and practical engagement with real problems. More's household during this period became a kind of humanist academy where learning flourished alongside political activity. Scholars visited to discuss classical texts and theological controversies. His children continued their education, with his eldest daughter Margaret becoming one of the most learned women in England, translating difficult theological works from Latin and corresponding with leading intellectuals. The family maintained regular schedules of prayer, study, and discussion, even as More's official responsibilities expanded. This household culture reflected More's conviction that political life shouldn't consume your entire identity or crowd out the intellectual and spiritual development that makes life meaningful. He demonstrated that it's possible to serve in government while maintaining commitments to learning, family, and religious devotion if you're sufficiently disciplined and clear about priorities. In 1529, More reached the pinnacle of political success when Henry VIII appointed him Lord Chancellor, making him the highest legal official in England and the King's chief minister. This appointment was extraordinary on multiple levels. More was the first layman to hold the position of Lord Chancellor, which had traditionally been reserved for high-ranking clergy. He rose to this position purely through merit and ability rather than noble birth or military service. He reached the heights of power while maintaining a reputation for integrity, unusual among successful politicians. More's tenure as Lord Chancellor demonstrated his judicial philosophy and practice. He worked tirelessly to reform the legal system, making courts more accessible to poor litigants and reducing the delays and expenses that favored wealthy defendants. He tried to simplify procedures and eliminate technicalities that enabled clever lawyers to manipulate outcomes. He heard cases himself with legendary fairness, refusing to favor powerful interests or accept the bribes that were routine in Renaissance legal systems. But More's time as Lord Chancellor coincided with the beginning of the crisis that would ultimately cost him his life. King Henry VIII had become desperate to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn in hopes of producing a male heir. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage, the king began moving toward breaking with Rome and establishing royal supremacy over the English Church. This put More in an impossible position. As Lord Chancellor, he was expected to support and implement royal policy. But as a Catholic theologian with sophisticated understanding of ecclesiology and papal authority, he believed that the king's proposed course was both legally invalid and spiritually disastrous. He understood that Henry's divorce wasn't really about marriage law or biblical interpretation. It was about power, specifically about whether secular rulers could override religious authority when it suited their political or personal interests. More had spent his entire career navigating the intersection of political service and personal principle. He'd learned how to serve loyally while maintaining his integrity, how to work within systems he didn't entirely approve of, and how to find room for conscience within the structures of power. But Henry's divorce and the break with Rome presented questions that couldn't be finessed through clever legal arguments or strategic compromise. These issues went to the heart of More's understanding of religious authority, moral truth, and the limits of political power. He believed that certain truths, transcended human authority, that the king couldn't simply declare his marriage invalid because he wanted a different wife, that Parliament couldn't make the king head of the church simply by passing legislation, and that no earthly power could override the fundamental constitution of the Christian church as More understood it. More tried desperately to avoid direct confrontation. When Henry proposed the divorce, More privately expressed his opinion that the marriage was valid, but avoided public opposition. When the break with Rome began, More attempted to remain silent on the issues while continuing his other duties. When pressure mounted to declare support for the king's position, More resigned as Lord Chancellor in 1532, claiming ill health, but actually withdrawing from a situation he could no longer navigate with integrity. This resignation represented More's attempt at what we might call strategic retreat, removing himself from direct participation in policies he opposed while avoiding public confrontation that would force either complete compliance or open rebellion. It was a sophisticated political move by someone who understood power's dynamics intimately. By resigning rather than being dismissed, More maintained some dignity and autonomy. By avoiding public criticism of the king's position, he reduced the immediate threat to himself and his family. By withdrawing to private life, he hoped to escape the impossible choice between betraying his conscience and defying his king. But More's enemies and the king's own insecurity wouldn't allow him this escape. His silence itself became threatening because More's reputation for integrity and learning meant that his refusal to endorse the king's actions carried enormous symbolic weight. If someone of More's stature and accomplishments wouldn't support Henry's break with Rome, it suggested that the king's position might be morally or legally questionable. The Act of Succession in 1534 required all subjects to swear an oath accepting the annulment of Henry's first marriage and the validity of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. More was willing to accept the succession of Anne's children to the throne, a political matter where the king's authority was clear. But he refused to swear the oath as written because it included theological claims about the invalidity of the first marriage and implicitly rejected papal authority. This distinction reveals More's sophisticated understanding of political philosophy. He recognized the king's legitimate authority over political matters like succession, while denying that the king could command agreement with religious or theological propositions. He was willing to obey legitimate commands, but not to surrender his conscience or affirm beliefs he thought false. More's refusal to take the oath wasn't based on simple stubbornness or religious fanaticism. It represented the culmination of his life's thinking about the relationship between political authority and individual conscience, between human law and divine truth, and between loyalty to earthly rulers and loyalty to transcendent principles. He'd spent decades studying political philosophy, practicing law, and serving in government. He understood exactly what governments could and couldn't legitimately demand from citizens. He knew that some boundaries must not be crossed if political authority is to remain legitimate rather than becoming tyranny. His refusal was carefully calibrated to maintain maximum respect for royal authority while preserving the core of individual conscience. He didn't denounce the king as a tyrant or call for rebellion. He simply said that he couldn't in good conscience swear to propositions he believed to be false, while acknowledging the king's right to rule and expressing hope that the king wouldn't punish him for following his conscience. More was imprisoned in the Tower of London in April 1534. He would spend the last 15 months of his life in this confinement, separated from his family, stripped of his property, and subjected to increasing pressure to conform to the king's demands. These months of imprisonment tested everything. More believed about human nature, courage, political authority, and the life well lived. His writings from this period, particularly his letters to his daughter Margaret and his devotional works, like a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, reveal someone facing death with extraordinary clarity and courage. He didn't rage against injustice or wallow in self-pity. He examined his motives carefully to ensure he wasn't dying for pride or stubbornness, rather than genuine principle. He considered honestly whether he might be wrong in his assessment of the theological questions at stake. He struggled with very human fear of suffering and death, while working to maintain his spiritual focus and moral resolve. These writings show that More's courage wasn't based on certainty or fanaticism. He acknowledged doubts and fears while choosing to act on his best judgment despite uncertainty. He understood that moral courage often means acting on imperfect knowledge when waiting for perfect clarity would mean surrender to injustice. His approach to facing death reflected his broader philosophy of how humans should deal with suffering and adversity. He believed that suffering could serve spiritual purposes by testing and strengthening character, that facing death honestly requires both practical preparation and spiritual reflection, and that maintaining moral integrity through suffering is itself a victory, regardless of external outcomes. More maintained his characteristic wit and humor even in prison. When his daughter Margaret urged him to take the oath to save his life, he gently but firmly explained why he couldn't comply, using examples and analogies to help her understand without making her feel guilty for caring about his survival. When interrogators tried to trap him with sophisticated legal arguments, he matched their reasoning while avoiding explicit statements that could be used as evidence of treason. His behavior in prison demonstrated that principle needn't be grim or humorless, that courage can coexist with awareness of life's absurdities, and that maintaining human relationships and kindness matters even when facing death. The trial of Thomas More in 1535 was a legal farce that nevertheless revealed important truths about power and justice. More was charged with treason for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England. The evidence against him was legally questionable and obtained through dubious means, including perjured testimony about private conversations. More conducted his own defense with legendary skill, demonstrating his legal mastery even while weakened by imprisonment. He challenged the legitimacy of the new laws under which he was being tried, arguing that statutes passed by Parliament couldn't override fundamental principles of Christian theology or the ancient constitution of the Church. He pointed out that the European-wide consensus of Christendom couldn't be overturned by the local legislation of a single kingdom. He noted that his silence on the issues at stake should be interpreted charitably rather than as implicit treason. His defense raised fundamental questions about legal philosophy that remain relevant today. Can legislatures make anything legal simply by passing laws? Or are there limits beyond which human legislation becomes invalid? Do citizens have a right to follow their conscience on fundamental moral and religious questions? Or must they submit to whatever the state demands? What makes laws legitimate rather than merely coercive? When More was inevitably convicted and sentenced to death, he finally broke his strategic silence and spoke openly about his beliefs. In a remarkable speech, he declared that the act of supremacy was invalid because it contradicted God's law and the ancient traditions of Christendom. He compared England's break with Rome to one town in a kingdom deciding to pass its own laws contrary to the general law of the realm. He expressed hope that his judges would join him in heaven despite their verdict against him, showing that he harbored no personal anger even toward those who condemned him to death. This final speech wasn't the rant of a defeated fanatic. It was the carefully reasoned argument of someone who'd spent his life thinking about law, authority, and justice. More laid out his political philosophy with clarity and courage, explaining exactly why he believed that political power had limits and that some authorities transcended human legislation. On July 6, 1535, Thomas More was beheaded on Tower Hill. According to witnesses, he maintained his composure and wit to the end. He reportedly needed help climbing the scaffold because he'd been weakened by imprisonment, joking with his executioner and asking the crowd to pray for him and witness that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first. His last words perfectly encapsulated his life's philosophy. The attempt to serve legitimate earthly authority while recognizing higher loyalties that must take precedence when the two conflict. This wasn't rebellion against political authority, but recognition that such authority has inherent limits, and that some truths transcend human power to alter through legislation or force. Part 3. The philosophy of conscience, authority, and human dignity. More's martyrdom tends to overshadow his intellectual legacy, reducing his philosophy to simple religious conviction or political stubbornness. But careful examination of his life and writings reveals a sophisticated political and moral philosophy that speaks to permanent questions about human existence in society. At the foundation of More's thought lies a particular understanding of human dignity grounded in both classical philosophy and Christian theology. He believed that human beings possess inherent worth that doesn't derive from social status, political authority, or utilitarian value. This dignity comes from being created in God's image, possessing rational souls capable of knowing truth and choosing good, and being destined for eternal existence beyond this earthly life. This conception of human dignity has profound political implications. If every person possesses inherent worth regardless of social position, then political authority exists to serve human flourishing rather than human beings existing to serve the state. Governments are legitimate only insofar as they recognize and protect this fundamental dignity. Laws that violate human dignity are unjust, regardless of whether they're properly enacted through constitutional procedures. This foundation makes More's philosophy fundamentally different from purely positivist legal theories that define justice as whatever the sovereign commands, or utilitarian approaches that judge actions solely by their consequences for overall social welfare. More insisted that some moral truths exist independently of human preferences or legislative decisions, and that these truths constrain what governments can legitimately demand from citizens. The concept of conscience occupies a central place in More's philosophy. He understood conscience not as mere personal preference or subjective feeling, but as the faculty by which humans perceive moral truth. Conscience requires formation through education, reflection, and exposure to wisdom traditions. But once properly formed, conscience creates obligations that can't be overridden by political authority or social pressure. More's defense of conscience wasn't based on relativism or the idea that everyone's beliefs are equally valid. He thought some conscientious judgments were correct and others mistaken, and he believed that people should work to form their consciences accurately through study and reflection. But he also insisted that even mistaken conscience must be respected, because forcing people to act against their sincere moral convictions violates their human dignity and corrupts both the individual and society. This position was radical in 16th century Europe, where religious unity enforced through state power was considered essential for social order. Both Catholics and Protestants generally believed that heresy should be suppressed through persecution, because religious error threatened both individual souls and social stability. More himself had participated in prosecuting heretics when he was Lord Chancellor, believing that protection of religious truth justified coercion against those who spread dangerous errors. His own experience of persecution for conscience's sake appears to have deepened his understanding of these issues, though he never fully worked out the tensions in his position. The fact that he defended his own conscience while having earlier violated others reveals an inconsistency that More recognized, but never completely resolved. This struggle reflects a genuine difficulty in political philosophy: how to balance conviction that certain truths are objectively correct with recognition that coercing agreement violates human dignity and often strengthens rather than eliminates error. More's philosophy of political authority built on these foundations of human dignity and conscience. He believed that political power ultimately derives from the community it governs rather than from divine right or natural superiority of rulers. Kings and governments have authority only because it's been granted to them, explicitly or implicitly, by the people they govern for purposes of promoting common good. This view makes political authority instrumental rather than absolute. Governments exist to serve specific purposes: maintaining order, administering justice, protecting rights, and promoting conditions for human flourishing. When governments fail to serve these purposes or actively undermine them, their authority becomes questionable and potentially illegitimate. More didn't advocate for democracy as we understand it. He lived in an age when monarchy seemed the natural form of government, and popular rule was associated with mob violence and instability. But his philosophy contained democratic elements in its insistence that legitimate authority serves the community rather than ruling it for the ruler's benefit. His conception of law emphasized that good laws reflect reason and natural justice rather than simply the will of whoever holds power. Laws are legitimate when they promote genuine common good, apply equally to all citizens, and respect fundamental rights and dignity. Laws that violate these standards are unjust regardless of their formal validity, and citizens may have obligations to resist them through appropriate means. This legal philosophy appears throughout More's writings and actions. In Utopia, he depicted laws as tools for promoting justice and common welfare rather than instruments for maintaining privilege. In his legal practice, he tried to ensure that procedures served justice rather than becoming ends in themselves. In his defense at trial, he argued that unjust laws don't bind conscience even if they're technically constitutional. More's understanding of justice emphasized both fairness in distribution of benefits and burdens and respect for rights and dignity. He believed that extreme inequalities of wealth and power undermine social solidarity and corrupt both rich and poor. Utopia's communal property system was partly a thought experiment about whether eliminating private property might reduce inequality and the social evils it produces. But More wasn't a simplistic egalitarian who thought all differences in condition must be eliminated. He recognized that people differ in abilities, that social organization requires some hierarchy and specialization, and that complete uniformity would stifle the diversity that makes communities flourish. His concern was with inequalities so extreme that they enable exploitation, destroy community, and prevent large numbers of people from developing their potential. The role of education occupied a central place in More's vision of human development and social improvement. He believed that properly designed education could develop human capacities for reasoning, moral judgment, and aesthetic appreciation, while forming character and transmitting cultural wisdom across generations. Education shouldn't be mere technical training or socialization into existing social roles. It should cultivate the whole person, intellectual abilities, moral sensibilities, practical judgment, and spiritual awareness together. This comprehensive vision of education reflected his humanist conviction that learning should serve human flourishing in all its dimensions. More's educational practice in his own household demonstrated these principles. His children studied classical languages, literature, philosophy, and theology alongside practical skills and moral formation. He emphasized that learning should be enjoyable rather than forced, that understanding matters more than memorization, and that education continues throughout life rather than ending with formal schooling. His insistence on educating daughters equally with sons was revolutionary for his time and reflected his conviction that human dignity and rational capacity don't depend on gender. If women possess the same essential nature as men, they deserve the same educational opportunities and moral respect. More's philosophy of the relationship between individual and community tried to balance legitimate personal freedom with social obligations and common good. He rejected both radical individualism that denies social responsibilities and totalitarian collectivism that erases individual identity and conscience. Human beings are inherently social, finding their identity and fulfillment partly through relationships and participation in communities. But individuals aren't simply means to collective ends or cells in a social organism. Each person possesses inherent worth and ultimate destiny that transcends any earthly community. This creates a creative tension in More's thought between personal autonomy and social responsibility. People have obligations to their communities, to obey just laws, pay fair taxes, serve in legitimate political offices, and contribute to common welfare. But they also have rights and freedoms that communities must respect, including freedom of conscience on fundamental moral and religious questions. More's understanding of courage and moral virtue emphasized that these qualities must be developed through practice and tested through adversity. He didn't believe that knowing what's right automatically produces right action. Character formation requires habituation in virtue, cultivation of proper emotional responses, and strengthening of will through repeated choices. His own preparation for martyrdom reflected this understanding. He didn't simply wake up one day able to choose death over compromise. He'd spent his entire life practicing virtue, examining his motives, and strengthening his moral resolve through smaller acts of integrity and self-discipline. The hair shirt he wore constantly was partly a spiritual discipline and partly a practice in bearing discomfort, preparing him for the ultimate test. More's writings from prison reveal his understanding of suffering's role in moral development and spiritual growth. He believed that adversity tests and reveals character, that facing mortality honestly deepens appreciation of what truly matters, and that maintaining integrity through suffering is itself a kind of victory regardless of external outcomes. This wasn't masochism or devaluing of earthly life. More enjoyed worldly pleasures, loved his family deeply, and grieved the loss of his former life. But he believed that preserving moral integrity and spiritual authenticity mattered more than avoiding suffering or extending life through compromise. His philosophy of facing death emphasized both practical preparation and spiritual reflection. He thought people should examine their lives honestly, seek to repair damaged relationships, ensure their affairs are in order, and prepare their souls through prayer and contemplation. But he rejected morbid preoccupation with death or denial of death's reality. The goal was to face mortality honestly while maintaining engagement with life and commitment to what makes existence meaningful. More's wit and humor, which persisted even on the scaffold, reflected his understanding that human dignity includes the capacity to find meaning and even joy in the darkest circumstances. Humor doesn't diminish the seriousness of suffering, but demonstrates that the human spirit can transcend circumstances through perspective and resilience. Part 4. The enduring relevance of More's political wisdom. The obvious question about Thomas More's philosophy is whether it remains relevant for people living in radically different circumstances than 16th century England. We don't face the same religious controversies, political structures, or social arrangements that shaped More's thinking. Our problems seem to require different solutions than those More proposed or embodied. Yet careful examination reveals that More addressed permanent features of political existence that persist across changing historical circumstances. The fundamental questions he grappled with, the limits of political authority, the rights of conscience, the relationship between individual and community, the nature of justice and legitimate law, remain central to political philosophy and practical politics today. Consider the question of when citizens should obey government authority and when conscience requires resistance. Every modern society struggles with this balance. Should people comply with laws they believe unjust? What are the limits of legitimate civil disobedience? When does obedience to legal authority become complicity with evil? More's example provides a sophisticated model for thinking about these questions. He wasn't a revolutionary who rejected political authority generally, or believed that any objectionable policy justified rebellion. He served loyally in government for years, implementing policies he might personally have questioned and working within systems he didn't entirely approve. His philosophy allowed for extensive pragmatic compromise in pursuit of practical goals. But More also recognized that some boundaries couldn't be crossed without surrendering moral integrity entirely. Some demands by political authority violate conscience so fundamentally that compliance would constitute betrayal of core identity and values. His challenge was identifying where those boundaries lay and how to resist illegitimate demands without unnecessary rebellion against legitimate authority. This discriminating approach to political obligation remains relevant for citizens in any society. Wholesale rejection of political authority leads to anarchism and social chaos. uncritical obedience to authority enables tyranny and prevents moral progress. The challenge is developing principles for distinguishing legitimate exercises of authority from illegitimate ones, and determining how to resist appropriately when authority oversteps its bounds. More's philosophy emphasized several key principles for making these determinations. Political authority is legitimate when it serves genuine common good rather than rulers' private interests. Laws are just when they reflect reason and natural justice rather than simply imposing the will of whoever holds power. Governments may require obedience in political and prudential matters where reasonable people might disagree, but they can't command agreement with propositions about fundamental moral or religious truth that individuals believe false. These principles don't provide automatic answers to every particular question about political obligation. Reasonable people will disagree about where to draw boundaries between legitimate authority and illegitimate demands. But they provide a framework for thinking through these questions in ways that balance respect for political authority with protection of individual conscience and human dignity. The contemporary challenges of authoritarianism and democratic backsliding make More's insights especially relevant. Around the world, governments are increasingly demanding not just obedience to laws, but affirmation of official ideologies, suppression of dissenting viewpoints, and participation in activities that violate individual conscience. More's example demonstrates that it's possible to maintain personal integrity while living under such regimes without either collaborating fully with injustice or engaging in futile revolutionary violence. His strategy involves several elements that remain applicable today. First, distinguish clearly between what you can legitimately comply with and what requires resistance. Not every objectionable policy justifies martyrdom. Save your resistance for matters that genuinely violate core principles. Second, express your dissent through strategic silence rather than unnecessary provocation when possible. More tried desperately to avoid direct confrontation, recognizing that prudent resistance is more effective than theatrical defiance. Third, when forced to choose between compliance and conscience, choose conscience but do so with minimum possible damage to other values you hold. More resisted the specific demand to affirm propositions he believed false while continuing to express loyalty to the king's legitimate authority. Fourth, maintain human relationships and kindness even with those who disagree with or oppose you. More showed respect to his judges, forgave those who testified against him, and tried to prevent his resistance from causing unnecessary harm to others. The question of religious freedom and tolerance in pluralistic societies connects directly to More's struggles. How should societies handle deep disagreements about fundamental values and beliefs? Can social unity and order be maintained when citizens hold incompatible worldviews? More lived during the breakdown of medieval religious unity, when these questions became existentially urgent. His initial response, persecution of heretics to protect religious truth and social order, represented one traditional answer that has proven both morally problematic and practically ineffective. His later defense of his own conscience suggested a different approach, though he never fully developed its implications. The argument for respecting conscience, even when you believe it's mistaken, rests on several foundations that More's experience illuminates. First, coercing agreement in matters of conscience violates human dignity and corrupts both individuals and societies. People can't genuinely believe propositions simply because they're forced to affirm them. Forcing such affirmations produces either hypocrites, who publicly profess beliefs they privately reject, or martyrs whose suffering testifies against the system that persecutes them. Second, allowing freedom of conscience actually strengthens social order rather than undermining it. Religious wars and persecution create far more instability and suffering than tolerating diverse beliefs within common political frameworks. When governments respect conscience while maintaining order and justice in other areas, diverse communities can coexist productively despite deep disagreements. Third, intellectual and moral progress requires freedom to question prevailing orthodoxies and propose alternative views. If everyone must conform to official beliefs, societies lose the critical examination that corrects errors and generates new insights. This argument from the social benefits of tolerance differs from relativistic claims that all beliefs are equally valid or that truth is simply a matter of personal preference. It's possible to believe that some views are objectively correct while also believing that coercing agreement violates human dignity and undermines the search for truth. More's philosophy of law and justice speaks directly to contemporary debates about legal positivism, natural law, and civil disobedience. His position that unjust laws don't bind conscience challenges the common assumption that whatever is legal is thereby legitimate. This stance has profound implications for thinking about legal systems and citizens' obligations. Legal positivism, in its strong forms, claims that law is simply whatever the sovereign commands through proper procedures. The validity of law doesn't depend on its content or consistency with moral principles. Citizens should obey laws because they are laws, regardless of whether they're just or unjust. More's philosophy rejected this position as dangerous and false. He insisted that law isn't simply power exercised through procedural forms. Legitimate law must meet substantive standards of justice and reasonableness. Laws that grossly violate these standards lose their binding force even if they're formally constitutional. This view grounds civil disobedience in recognition that legal systems can produce unjust results, that citizens have moral obligations that transcend legal obligations, and that sometimes preserving moral integrity requires refusing to comply with unjust laws. But More's approach also avoids the opposite extreme of making every individual the final judge of which laws to obey, based on personal preferences. He distinguished between cases where laws violate fundamental moral principles and cases where they're merely imperfect or unwise. Citizens should generally defer to legal authority, even when they disagree with particular policies, reserving resistance for situations where compliance would require betraying core moral convictions. The contemporary challenges of technological surveillance, data privacy, and digital control over information make More's insights about power and individual autonomy especially relevant. Modern governments and corporations possess surveillance capabilities that would have seemed like magic to Renaissance rulers. They can monitor communications, track movements, analyze behaviors, and shape information environments in ways that create unprecedented opportunities for manipulation and control. More's philosophy emphasized that individuals possess domains of thought and conscience that must remain beyond political control. The state can regulate actions that harm others or undermine legitimate public purposes, but it can't legitimately demand access to private thoughts, force affirmation of beliefs people don't hold, or completely eliminate spaces of personal autonomy. These principles suggest important limits on surveillance and information control, even when such powers are exercised for plausible security or efficiency purposes. The fact that governments technically can monitor all communications doesn't mean they should, or that citizens must accept such monitoring without question. More's philosophy would support strong protections for privacy, freedom of thought, and spaces of personal autonomy, even from well-intentioned government intrusion. The increasing polarization and tribalism in contemporary politics reflects precisely the kind of unreflective partisan loyalty that More's life challenged. He demonstrated that it's possible to maintain strong convictions while respecting those who disagree, to serve in government without surrendering your independent judgment, and to resist political pressure without demonizing those who make different choices. More's approach to political disagreement emphasized several principles worth recovering today. First, separate evaluation of ideas from evaluation of people who hold those ideas. You can believe someone is profoundly wrong about important questions while still respecting their dignity and good faith. Second, acknowledge that complex political questions rarely have obvious answers that only fools or villains could dispute. Intelligent, sincere people reach different conclusions about how to balance competing values and address complicated problems. Third, focus on the quality of reasoning and evidence rather than the tribal affiliation of those making arguments. The goal of political discourse should be discovering truth and promoting common good rather than defeating opponents and advancing factional interests. Fourth, maintain personal relationships across political disagreements when possible. More remained friends with people who made different choices than he did about the divorce controversy and religious reform. The educational challenges facing contemporary societies connect directly to More's humanistic vision of comprehensive human development. Modern education often focuses narrowly on technical skills and economic productivity, treating students as future workers rather than whole human beings with moral, aesthetic, and spiritual dimensions. More's approach emphasized that education should cultivate wisdom and character alongside professional competence, that learning should connect to life's deepest questions rather than being purely instrumental, and that educational institutions should form communities of inquiry rather than simply processing students through credentialing systems. His practice of including women in serious intellectual education, radical for his time, speaks to ongoing questions about equal access to educational opportunities. If human dignity doesn't depend on accidents of birth, like gender or social class, then justice requires ensuring that everyone has opportunities to develop their potential rather than being locked into predetermined roles. The contemporary crisis of meaning and purpose that affects many people in materially prosperous societies reflects the kind of spiritual poverty that More warned against. He understood that humans need more than physical comfort and security. They need purposes worth pursuing, connections to communities and traditions, moral frameworks for making sense of experience, and hope for significance that transcends biological existence. More's life demonstrated that meaning comes partly from commitment to truth and principle, even when costly, from service to others and purposes beyond self-interest, from intellectual and spiritual development, and from relationships characterized by genuine love and respect rather than mere transaction. His philosophy suggested that societies that focus exclusively on material prosperity and personal autonomy while neglecting moral formation and spiritual development will produce people who are successful by conventional standards, but empty at the core. The environmental challenges facing humanity require exactly the kind of long-term thinking and willingness to sacrifice immediate interests for higher purposes that More embodied. Addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion requires collective action oriented toward goals that transcend individual lifetimes and national boundaries. More's philosophy emphasized that legitimate purposes can demand significant sacrifice from individuals and communities, that short-term interests must sometimes be subordinated to long-term welfare, and that human flourishing requires sustaining the conditions that make meaningful life possible for future generations. His example of choosing death over compromise suggests the level of commitment that may be necessary for addressing challenges that threaten civilization itself. Perhaps most importantly, More's life and thought demonstrate that individual integrity and moral courage matter even when they don't achieve immediate practical success. He didn't stop Henry VIII's break with Rome or prevent the religious conflicts that would tear England apart. His death didn't change royal policy or convince others to follow his example in sufficient numbers to reverse the political changes he opposed. Yet More's witness retained power precisely because he maintained his integrity regardless of outcomes. He proved that preserving moral character and human dignity isn't simply a means to external goals, but possesses intrinsic value that persists even when particular battles are lost. This understanding becomes crucial during periods when political and social change seems to make traditional values and practices obsolete. The fact that powerful forces are moving in a particular direction doesn't automatically make that direction right or inevitable. Individuals and communities who maintain alternative visions and practices serve crucial functions even when they can't immediately prevail. They preserve possibilities that future generations may need. They witness to truths that dominant forces try to suppress, and they demonstrate that conformity isn't inevitable even when it appears overwhelmingly advantageous. More's philosophy ultimately rests on a conception of human existence that acknowledges both our limitation and our grandeur. We are finite creatures, subject to death, bound by circumstances we didn't choose, limited in knowledge and power. Yet we possess capacities for reason, moral judgment, and transcendence that enable us to imagine alternatives to existing conditions, to commit ourselves to principles beyond immediate self-interest, and to find meaning in circumstances that seem designed to crush the human spirit. This vision of human nature, neither naively optimistic nor cynically despairing, provides a foundation for political philosophy that balances realism about power's dynamics with idealism about human potential. We need political structures because humans are flawed and self-interested, but we can create just political orders because humans are capable of reason and virtue. The legacy of Thomas More lies not in any specific doctrine or political program, but in his demonstration that intellectual excellence, political engagement, and moral integrity can be integrated in a single life. He proved that it's possible to be simultaneously sophisticated in understanding how power works and uncompromising in maintaining ethical principles, both effective in worldly affairs and faithful to transcendent values, both prudent in most matters and willing to die for ultimate commitments. Every age faces circumstances where these tensions between principle and pragmatism, individual conscience and social duty, worldly success and moral integrity become acute. More's example doesn't provide simple formulas for resolving these tensions, but it demonstrates that they can be navigated with wisdom, courage, and grace by people who maintain clarity about what truly matters while remaining engaged with the messy realities of political and social life. His questions remain our questions. His dilemmas remain our dilemmas. And his courage remains an inspiration for everyone who struggles to maintain integrity while living responsibly in imperfect societies. The examined life that Socrates declared worth living, More lived to its ultimate conclusion, choosing death when compromise would have meant betraying the deepest truth of his existence. In this sense, More carries forward the philosophical tradition while demonstrating its practical application in circumstances of extreme pressure and ultimate stakes. His legacy endures not because he had all the answers, but because he asked the right questions and lived them fully. In a world that increasingly demands conformity to ideological orthodoxies, values power over principle, and confuses success with meaning, Thomas More's witness to conscience, dignity, and truth remains as relevant as when he climbed the scaffold with wit, courage, and unshakable integrity. His life continues to ask us the questions that matter most. What do we truly believe? What are we willing to suffer for? How do we maintain our humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it? These aren't merely historical or philosophical questions. They're the challenges every person faces in navigating the tension between our highest aspirations and our daily compromises, between who we want to be and who circumstances pressure us to become. More's life demonstrates that these tensions can be lived faithfully, that integrity is possible even in the most corrupt circumstances, and that individual choices about principle and conscience matter profoundly even when they don't change external outcomes. In every generation, there are individuals who hear the call to stand for truth despite cost, to maintain conscience despite pressure, and to choose integrity despite consequences. They inherit More's example not as a historical curiosity, but as a living tradition of moral courage and philosophical wisdom applied to the permanent challenges of political existence. His final words, that he died the king's good servant, but God's first, continue to resonate because they articulate the balance every person must strike between legitimate earthly authorities and transcendent loyalties that claim ultimate allegiance. The challenge isn't choosing between engagement and withdrawal, political effectiveness and moral purity, pragmatism and idealism. The challenge is integrating these dimensions of existence in ways that honor both our responsibilities to the communities we inhabit and our obligations to truths that transcend any particular society or era. Thomas More's philosophy and example provide resources for this ongoing task of becoming fully human in circumstances that often seem designed to reduce us to something less. His witness endures because it speaks to permanent dimensions of political existence that every society must address and every individual must confront in forming their identity and choosing their commitments. The questions he lived and died for remain the questions that define what it means to be human at the deepest level. Part 5. More's literary achievement and the power of imagination. Beyond his political career and martyrdom, Thomas More's literary accomplishments reveal another dimension of his philosophy: the belief that imagination and creative writing could serve as powerful tools for social criticism and moral education. His approach to literature wasn't escapist or purely aesthetic. He believed that stories, dialogues, and fictional scenarios could illuminate truth in ways that direct argument couldn't achieve. Utopia remains More's most famous literary work, but understanding its significance requires grasping how revolutionary its method was. Before More, political philosophy typically took the form of systematic treatises arguing for particular positions. Plato's Republic was the notable exception, using dialogue form to explore ideas dramatically. More innovated by creating a fully realized fictional society that readers could imaginatively inhabit. The genius of this approach lies in its ability to defamiliarize the familiar. When you're immersed in your own society's arrangements, they seem natural and inevitable. You can't easily imagine alternatives because you lack experience of different possibilities. By describing a completely different social order in concrete detail, More enabled readers to see their own societies from outside, recognizing that many supposedly necessary features are actually contingent choices. The descriptions of utopian society work on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, they present specific institutional arrangements: communal property, rotation of labor, simple laws, religious tolerance. But beneath these specifics lie deeper questions about values and priorities. What should societies optimize for? Individual freedom or collective welfare? Economic efficiency or equitable distribution? Cultural uniformity or diversity? Military strength or peaceful cooperation? More's utopians make different choices than European societies on virtually every significant question. They value leisure for intellectual and spiritual development over accumulation of wealth. They prefer equality and social solidarity over hierarchy and competition. They choose peaceful diplomacy over military glory. They embrace religious diversity over enforced orthodoxy. By presenting these alternatives concretely rather than abstractly, More invited readers to examine whether European choices were really superior or simply familiar. The device of having Raphael Hythloday describe Utopia to a skeptical More the character creates layers of irony and ambiguity that enrich the work's philosophical content. Readers can't simply identify More's views with Raphael's enthusiasm or with More the character's skepticism. The tension between these positions forces readers to think for themselves about which utopian practices are admirable and which are problematic. This ambiguity isn't a weakness, but a sophisticated philosophical method. More understood that complex social questions rarely have simple answers, that intelligent people can reasonably disagree about fundamental values, and that forcing readers to think actively produces deeper understanding than simply presenting conclusions. The rhetorical strategy of Utopia also protected More from accusations of sedition or heresy. By putting radical ideas in the mouth of a fictional traveler describing an imaginary society, More could explore revolutionary possibilities while maintaining plausible deniability. If challenged, he could claim he was simply presenting interesting ideas for discussion rather than advocating for their implementation. This protective ambiguity became increasingly important as More's career progressed and political stakes rose. The same literary skills that enabled him to write Utopia safely would later help him navigate dangerous religious controversies through carefully chosen words and strategic silences. More's other literary works demonstrate the range of his intellectual interests and the consistency of his philosophical concerns. His history of King Richard III pioneered techniques of historical writing that would influence Shakespeare and later historians. Rather than simply chronicling events, More tried to understand the psychological motivations and moral character of historical figures. His portrayal of Richard III as a cunning tyrant who rose to power through deception and violence explored themes that connected directly to his political philosophy. What makes rulers legitimate or tyrannical? How do ambitious individuals manipulate political systems for personal gain? What are the consequences of divorcing power from morality? These questions weren't merely historical, but address permanent dangers in political life that every generation must guard against. More's Richard III demonstrates how unchecked ambition corrupts judgment, how power without moral constraint becomes monstrous, and how societies that tolerate or enable such corruption deserve their suffering. The history's literary qualities, vivid characterization, dramatic scenes, psychological insight, made its political lessons more effective than abstract argument could achieve. Readers remember Richard's character and choices in ways they wouldn't remember philosophical propositions about tyranny. More's devotional writings from his imprisonment reveal how he used literature as spiritual discipline and preparation for death. A dialogue of comfort against tribulation addresses the psychological and spiritual challenges of facing persecution, suffering, and death. Written as a conversation between two men discussing how to maintain faith and courage during Ottoman invasion of Hungary, the work allowed More to explore his own situation through protective fiction. The dialogue's philosophical depth comes from More's unflinching examination of human weakness and fear. He doesn't present suffering as easy or death as simple. He acknowledges that humans naturally resist pain and cling to life, that faith can waver under pressure, and that courage must be constantly renewed through reflection and prayer. But he also insists that suffering can serve redemptive purposes when properly understood. It tests and purifies character, reveals what truly matters by stripping away superficial concerns, creates opportunities for demonstrating virtue, and prepares souls for eternal existence beyond this temporary life. More's approach to suffering in the dialogue reflects his broader philosophy of how humans should relate to adversity and mortality. He rejected both stoic indifference that denies suffering's reality and despairing surrender that sees suffering as meaningless. The proper response involves acknowledging pain honestly while finding meaning and purpose that transcends immediate circumstances. His letters to his daughter Margaret from prison reveal the personal dimension of these philosophical principles. These weren't abstract treatises, but real communication between a father facing death and a daughter desperate for him to survive. The tenderness and humanity of these letters make their philosophical content more powerful. More explained his choices to Margaret with patient reasoning, using examples and analogies to help her understand without making her feel guilty for wanting him to live. He acknowledged her suffering and his own grief at separation from his family. He expressed confidence in her strength and learning while admitting his own fears and weaknesses. These letters demonstrate that More's moral courage wasn't based on inhuman strength or religious fanaticism. He was a loving father who cherished his family, a man who enjoyed life's pleasures and grieved their loss. His choice to die, rather than compromise, came from carefully reasoned conviction about what his conscience required, not from indifference to life or desire for martyrdom. The literary quality of More's controversial religious writings demonstrates how even polemical works can serve philosophical purposes beyond immediate debates. His responses to Protestant reformers like William Tyndale engaged serious questions about scriptural interpretation, church authority, and theological method. More's polemical style could be harsh and sometimes crude by modern standards. He used satire, personal attacks, and scatological humor that seems inappropriate for religious discussion. But this rhetorical strategy reflected his understanding that ideas have consequences and that errors about fundamental questions could lead souls astray and damage society. His polemical writings reveal tensions in More's philosophy that he never fully resolved. He argued passionately for respecting diverse viewpoints and tolerating disagreement in Utopia. Yet he persecuted heretics as Lord Chancellor and wrote viciously against Protestant reformers. He defended his own conscience against state coercion, yet he used state power to suppress others' religious convictions. This inconsistency reflects genuine difficulties in political philosophy rather than simple hypocrisy. More believed that objective truth exists about religious questions, that error can harm both individuals and society, and that authorities have responsibilities to protect people from dangerous falsehoods. But he also came to recognize through his own experience that coercing belief violates human dignity and often strengthens rather than eliminates error. These tensions appear in every society that believes in both objective truth and individual freedom. How do you balance conviction that certain beliefs are correct with recognition that forcing agreement corrupts both truth and freedom? More struggled with this question throughout his life, and his struggle reflects a permanent challenge rather than a problem he could definitively solve. The power of More's literary achievement lies partly in its accessibility. He wrote for educated laypeople rather than academic specialists, using dialogue, narrative, and dramatic scenes rather than technical philosophical terminology. This literary approach made complex ideas engaging and memorable while demonstrating that serious thought about fundamental questions didn't require specialized training. More's example suggested that anyone capable of following a story or conversation could participate in philosophical inquiry about politics, morality, and human nature. This democratic dimension of his literary method reflected his humanist conviction that wisdom should be pursued by all educated people rather than being monopolized by professional philosophers or theologians. Part 6. More's theology and the integration of faith and reason. More's philosophy can't be fully understood without examining his theological convictions and how they integrated with his political and moral thought. He wasn't a professional theologian, but his extensive reading in scripture and church tradition, combined with his legal training and philosophical sophistication, produced a distinctive approach to relating faith and reason. At the foundation of More's theology lay conviction that reason and revelation complement rather than contradict each other. God created human reason as a faculty for perceiving truth, so properly used reason should lead toward rather than away from religious faith. Natural human capacities for logic, observation, and moral judgment can discover important truths about God's existence, moral law, and human purpose. But reason alone has limits. Some truths about God's nature, human destiny, and proper worship require divine revelation because they transcend what unaided reason can discover. Scripture and church tradition preserve and transmit these revealed truths across generations, making them accessible to people in all times and places. This integration of natural reason and revealed faith meant that More saw no fundamental conflict between his philosophical studies and his religious commitments. Classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle had used reason to discover genuine truths about virtue, justice, and human flourishing. Christian revelation didn't contradict these insights, but completed and perfected them by adding dimensions of understanding that human reason couldn't reach independently. More's approach to biblical interpretation emphasized that Scripture should be read with both faith and reason. The Bible contains divinely inspired truth, but understanding that truth requires careful interpretation that considers literary genre, historical context, and theological tradition rather than simplistic literalism. This hermeneutical sophistication reflected his humanist training in textual analysis and his legal training in interpretive method. Just as legal texts must be interpreted according to established principles and precedents, so Scripture requires interpretation guided by church tradition and theological wisdom accumulated across centuries. More rejected both the Protestant principle of sola scriptura, that individuals could interpret Scripture for themselves without authoritative church guidance, and uncritical acceptance of any interpretation by church authorities. He believed that proper biblical interpretation required learning, humility, and attention to the community's wisdom across time, rather than either individual judgment or blind obedience to current authorities. His theology of the church emphasized that Christian community transcends any particular time or place. The church exists across history and geography, united by shared faith and practice rather than simply by contemporary institutional structures. This conception had profound implications for More's resistance to Henry VIII's break with Rome. He didn't refuse to acknowledge the king as supreme head of the church simply because he wanted to maintain papal authority for its own sake. He believed that Henry's claim represented an attempt by a particular ruler at a particular moment to override the consensus of Christian tradition across centuries and continents. More's argument was essentially constitutional. Just as a single town can't pass laws that contradict the general law of the kingdom, so a single nation can't redefine fundamental Christian doctrine, contrary to the worldwide church's teaching across history. This wasn't blind traditionalism, but sophisticated ecclesiology based on the idea that truth emerges from and is preserved by communities over time, rather than being accessible to isolated individuals or particular authorities. More's understanding of the relationship between church and state tried to balance several principles that exist in permanent tension. He believed that secular rulers have legitimate authority over political matters, taxation, criminal justice, military affairs, commercial regulation. The church shouldn't micromanage political decisions or claim direct authority over temporal matters where expertise lies with political leaders. But he also insisted that political authority has limits defined by moral and theological truth. Secular rulers can't command what God forbids or forbid what God commands. They can't define religious doctrine, alter the church's fundamental constitution, or demand that citizens affirm beliefs contrary to their informed conscience. This position created a permanent space for potential conflict between political and religious authority. What happens when secular rulers believe their policies are legitimate political matters while religious authorities or individual citizens believe they violate moral or theological truth? More had no simple formula for resolving such conflicts, but his life suggested several principles. First, try to avoid confrontation through prudent silence or strategic retreat when possible. Second, clearly distinguish what you can legitimately comply with from what absolutely requires resistance. Third, resist illegitimate demands through appropriate means that respect legitimate authority in other areas. Fourth, accept consequences of resistance with courage while maintaining charity toward those who disagree or oppose you. More's sacramental theology emphasized that physical realities could serve as vehicles for spiritual grace. The Eucharist was the central example, bread and wine becoming literally Christ's body and blood through consecration. But the principle extended more broadly to the idea that material creation could mediate divine presence rather than being merely profane matter opposed to sacred spirit. This sacramental vision informed More's approach to embodied existence. He didn't see physical pleasures and worldly activities as necessarily opposed to spiritual life. Eating good food, enjoying music and literature, loving your family, taking satisfaction in work well done. These natural human goods could contribute to overall flourishing when properly ordered toward ultimate purposes. The key was maintaining right priorities and avoiding disordered attachment that turned legitimate goods into idols. More's hair shirt wasn't rejection of physical pleasure, but practice in self-discipline that prevented legitimate pleasures from becoming addictive necessities. His theology of work and vocation emphasized that all legitimate occupations could serve God when performed faithfully. The medieval tradition had often suggested that religious vocations were spiritually superior to worldly careers. That contemplation ranked higher than action, and that leaving the world for monastery represented the surest path to holiness. More's life challenged these assumptions. He believed that lay people could achieve sanctity through faithful discharge of worldly responsibilities. That political service could be a form of religious devotion, and that one didn't need to flee the world to live righteously within it. This theology of the laity reflected More's broader conviction that sacred and secular shouldn't be rigidly separated. All of life, family relationships, professional work, political engagement, intellectual inquiry could be sanctified through proper motivation and faithful practice. More's spirituality combined active engagement with contemplative depth in ways that model how contemporary people might integrate spiritual life with worldly responsibilities. He maintained rigorous prayer practices, wore instruments of penance, studied scripture and theology, and cultivated awareness of divine presence. But he didn't retreat from family life, professional duties, or political engagement to pursue these spiritual practices. His example suggested that the challenge isn't choosing between spiritual depth and worldly engagement, but maintaining spiritual discipline while fully participating in ordinary life. This integration required extraordinary discipline and clear priorities. More rose before dawn for extended prayer because he knew that without such discipline, worldly responsibilities would crowd out spiritual practices. He studied theology because he understood that informed faith serves God better than ignorant piety. He practiced self-denial because he recognized that comfort and success could dull spiritual awareness. More's theology of martyrdom emphasized that dying for truth represents the ultimate testimony to what genuinely matters. The word martyr literally means witness. Martyrs testify, through their deaths, to truths they consider more important than biological survival. But More was careful to distinguish genuine martyrdom from fanatical self-destruction or suicidal despair. True martyrdom requires several elements that his life illustrated. First, it must be for authentic truth rather than stubborn pride or political ambition disguised as principle. More examined his motives carefully to ensure he was dying for conscience rather than ego. Second, it should be chosen only when necessary rather than sought for its own sake. More tried desperately to avoid martyrdom through strategic silence and retreat. He became a martyr only when no alternative remained consistent with integrity. Third, it must maintain charity toward those who impose death. More expressed hope that his judges would join him in heaven and showed no personal bitterness toward those who condemned him. Fourth, it should serve purposes beyond the martyr's own salvation. More's death testified to principles about conscience, authority, and human dignity that transcended his particular religious controversy. Part 7. The Complete Philosophy, Synthesis and Living Application. Having examined the various dimensions of More's thought, his political philosophy, moral theory, legal principles, literary achievement, and theological convictions, we can now synthesize these elements into a comprehensive vision of human existence and see how this philosophy applies to contemporary challenges. More's philosophy ultimately rests on a particular conception of what human beings are and what makes their lives meaningful. We're rational creatures, capable of perceiving truth and choosing good. But we're also embodied beings with physical needs and emotional attachments, social beings who find identity through relationships and communities, and spiritual beings with ultimate destiny beyond this earthly life. This multidimensional understanding of human nature meant that More rejected simplistic answers to questions about how we should live. Purely materialistic philosophies that reduce humans to biological organisms miss the rational, moral, and spiritual dimensions that distinguish us from other animals. Purely spiritual approaches that treat embodiment as prison or obstacle miss that physical existence is good and that moral life must be lived in and through bodily experience. Any adequate philosophy must account for all these dimensions of human nature without reducing any of them to the others. We need material security and physical health, but also meaning and purpose. We need individual autonomy and room for conscience, but also community and shared practices. We need to engage with temporal realities, but also to maintain awareness of eternal purposes. More's approach to knowledge and truth emphasized that different kinds of questions require different methods of investigation. Mathematical and logical truths can be demonstrated through pure reason. Empirical facts about the physical world require observation and experiment. Moral principles emerge from rational reflection on human nature and flourishing. Theological truths require revelation supplemented by rational interpretation. This epistemological pluralism meant that More rejected both rationalistic claims that pure reason could answer all questions and fideistic retreat into faith alone without reason. Different domains of inquiry have appropriate methods, and wisdom requires knowing which methods apply to which questions. His life demonstrated this integrated approach to knowledge. He used legal reasoning in courtrooms, theological argument in religious controversies, literary imagination in Utopia, empirical observation in political affairs, and rational philosophy in moral questions. He didn't compartmentalize these different ways of thinking. but allowed each to inform the others. More's ethical philosophy emphasized that moral life requires both developing virtuous character and following right principles. He wasn't a pure virtue ethicist who reduced morality to character traits, nor a pure deontologist who reduced it to rule following, nor a pure consequentialist who judged actions solely by outcomes. Instead, he recognized that complete moral theory must integrate all these dimensions. Character matters because having the right dispositions helps us perceive moral truth and act on it consistently. Someone who has developed courage will recognize situations requiring bravery and choose right action despite fear. But character alone isn't sufficient. We also need principles to guide judgment when situations are complex or virtuous dispositions conflict. Principles matter because some actions are wrong, regardless of who performs them or what consequences result. Certain boundaries shouldn't be crossed even by people of good character pursuing good ends. But principles alone aren't sufficient. We also need practical wisdom to apply them in particular circumstances. Consequences matter because our actions affect other people and ourselves in ways that count morally. We should consider outcomes when choosing among morally permissible options. But consequences alone aren't sufficient. Some actions are wrong even when they produce good results. More's moral philosophy also emphasized the role of community in forming character and conscience. We don't develop virtue in isolation, but through participation in communities that embody and transmit moral wisdom across generations. Family, schools, churches, professional associations, friendship networks. These institutions shape our values and provide context for practicing virtue. But More also recognized that communities can transmit error alongside wisdom, that social pressure can corrupt judgment, and that individuals sometimes must resist community consensus when it violates truth. The challenge is remaining open to wisdom, preserved in traditions and communities, while maintaining capacity for critical judgment when those traditions or communities go astray. His philosophy of education reflected these themes. Good education develops the whole person. Intellectual abilities, moral sensibilities, practical judgment, aesthetic appreciation, and spiritual awareness together. It transmits cultural wisdom while cultivating critical thinking. It trains in technical skills while developing character. It prepares for specific roles while forming for general human excellence. More's household embodied these educational principles. His children studied classical languages and literature to access wisdom from the past. They learned mathematics and logic to develop abstract reasoning. They studied scripture and theology to form faith and moral understanding. They practiced music and enjoyed literature to cultivate aesthetic sensibilities. They engaged in conversation and debate to develop practical judgment. They received moral instruction and spiritual formation alongside intellectual training. This comprehensive approach produced remarkable results. More's children, especially his daughter Margaret, became genuinely learned people capable of engaging seriously with complex ideas while maintaining strong moral characters and living faithfully in their social roles. More's political philosophy, fully developed, represented a sophisticated constitutional theory about the sources and limits of political authority. Legitimate government serves the common good of the community it governs. It maintains order, administers justice, protects rights, and creates conditions for human flourishing. Its authority derives ultimately from the community rather than from divine right or natural superiority of rulers. Laws are legitimate when they reflect reason and natural justice rather than merely imposing the will of those who hold power. They should apply equally to all citizens regardless of social status. They should be sufficiently clear that reasonable people can understand and follow them. They should be generally accepted by the community rather than maintained purely through force. When governments fail these standards, when they serve rulers' private interests rather than common good, when laws violate fundamental justice, when authorities claim powers they don't legitimately possess, their actions become questionable and potentially illegitimate. Citizens may have rights or even obligations to resist through appropriate means. But More's philosophy also emphasized that political authority deserves respect, even when imperfect. Perfect government doesn't exist, and waiting for perfection before offering compliance would produce only chaos. Prudent resistance distinguishes between situations requiring absolute opposition and situations where compromise or strategic compliance is appropriate. More's application of these principles to his own situation demonstrated sophisticated political judgment. He served loyally in government despite disagreeing with some policies. He implemented laws he might have written differently. He worked productively with colleagues whose values differed from his own. But when Henry VIII demanded that More affirm propositions about the king's marriage and church authority that More believed false, resistance became necessary. This wasn't minor policy disagreement or prudential judgment call. It involved fundamental questions about truth, authority, and conscience that couldn't be finessed through pragmatic compromise. More's example suggests several principles for thinking about when resistance to political authority becomes necessary. First, save resistance for situations involving fundamental principles rather than resisting every disagreeable policy. Second, clearly distinguish what requires resistance from what allows legitimate compliance. Third, resist through appropriate means that maintain maximum respect for legitimate authority in other areas. Fourth, accept consequences of resistance without unnecessary bitterness or self-pity. These principles don't provide automatic answers, but they offer a framework for navigating the permanent tension between political obligation and individual conscience that every person must confront. More's philosophy of death and how to face it emerged from his theological convictions about eternal life. His moral emphasis on maintaining integrity regardless of circumstances, and his practical experience of imprisonment and approaching execution. He believed that death isn't the end of personal existence, but transition to eternal life where earthly choices have permanent consequences. This made preserving moral integrity more important than extending biological life, since what happens to the soul matters infinitely more than what happens to the body. But More didn't embrace death morbidly or devalue earthly life. He loved his family deeply, enjoyed worldly pleasures, and grieved the loss of his former life. He recognized death as natural evil and legitimate object of fear. His courage came not from indifference to life, but from conviction that some things matter more than survival. His preparation for death involved both practical arrangements and spiritual discipline. He tried to complete his affairs, repair damaged relationships, and prepare his family for his absence. He examined his conscience to ensure his resistance was based on genuine principle rather than pride or stubbornness. He strengthened his resolve through prayer and contemplation. He maintained his characteristic wit and human warmth despite fear and suffering. This approach to mortality reflects More's broader philosophy of how humans should face adversity and suffering. He rejected both stoic indifference that denies suffering's reality and despairing surrender that sees pain as meaningless. Proper response involves acknowledging difficulty honestly, while finding meaning and purpose that transcend immediate circumstances. More's legacy for contemporary life involves several key insights that remain relevant despite changed circumstances. First, individuals can maintain integrity while participating in imperfect institutions if they're clear about fundamental commitments while remaining flexible about methods. Second, political authority has limits defined by moral truth and human dignity, and sometimes preserving integrity requires resistance despite personal cost. Third, intellectual excellence, professional success, and moral integrity can be integrated rather than being forced to conflict. Fourth, education should develop whole persons rather than merely training workers or transmitting information. Fifth, communities and traditions transmit wisdom, but also require critical examination when they go astray. Sixth, meaning comes partly from commitment to truth and principle, even when costly, from service to purposes beyond self-interest, and from relationships characterized by genuine love rather than mere transaction. These insights don't provide simple solutions to contemporary challenges, but they offer resources for thinking about permanent questions that every person in society must address. How do we balance individual freedom with social solidarity? When does loyalty to institutions become complicity with injustice? How can we maintain moral seriousness without self-righteousness? What makes life meaningful beyond pleasure and success? More's example demonstrates that these questions can be lived faithfully even in circumstances designed to make integrity impossible. His witness continues because it addresses not historical curiosities, but permanent features of human existence in political community. Every generation faces situations where power demands compliance with injustice, where success requires compromising principles, and where speaking truth risks destruction. In those moments, More's life asks us whether we possess the clarity to recognize what truly matters and the courage to act on that recognition despite cost. The ultimate lesson of Thomas More's philosophy and example is that human dignity consists partly in capacity to commit ourselves to truths that transcend self-interest and to maintain that commitment regardless of consequences. This capacity distinguishes us from other animals and from humans who surrender their autonomy to power or circumstance. In exercising this capacity, we become most fully human and most clearly reflect the divine image in which we're created. More's questions remain our questions, his struggles remain our struggles, and his courage remains an invitation to everyone who seeks to live with integrity in circumstances that reward compromise and punish principle.